tem um livro chamado Excessos e Exceções, e ele fez uma inovação nesse livro, nunca mais eu vi algo parecido. É assim, você tem nos livros você tem prefácios, vem no começo, você tem pós-fácios, que vem no final. O livro dele, nesse que eu falei, tem um mesofácio. Então o que nós temos aqui exatamente é uma abertura que não é na verdade uma abertura, é algo bem mais... O evento já começou e a gente no meio dá uma parada para refletir um pouquinho, fazer a saudação e depois continuar. Então é mais ou menos um mesofácio do nosso evento. Eu quero então passar a palavra para os colegas que estão aqui ao meu lado. Primeiro, o professor André Muniz, que é o chefe do Departamento de Filosofia, a sua saudação aos participantes.
Bem, boa tarde a todas e todos. É uma imensa satisfação que eu estou aqui para fazer essa abertura, que, enfim, é uma abertura no meio, já que o evento começou há algumas horas atrás. Mas, enfim, eu queria muito agradecer, em primeiro lugar, a professora Cecília pelo convite, agradecer ao professor Cecília e os demais professores que estão envolvidos na organização do evento. Gostaria de também agradecer aos estudantes, né, porque, enfim, isso é muito importante. É um ponto que eu gostaria de destacar, a presença, depois de um momento tão difícil para a universidade brasileira, acho que para a universidade no mundo todo, que foi os 2 anos e meio de confinamento obrigatório, compulsório, por causa da epidemia de Covid. A Universidade de Brasília vivia ali, depois do Uni, nos anos de 2010 em diante, né, entre 2010 e 2015, uma quantidade muito grande de eventos. A convivência era muito digamos, enriquecida por esses eventos, porque eram momentos em que os nossos estudantes conheciam também um pouco da comunidade nacional, não só regional, mas também nacional e internacional. Eu acho que este evento, o 10º Colóquio Internacional Pierre Bayle, ele, digamos, retoma, mas também avança, né, com relação a essa convivência acadêmica, já que, de alguma maneira, a gente aqui está podendo recepcionar colegas, enfim, do Brasil, mas também professores estrangeiros, o que é muito bem-vindo. Então, em nome do departamento, eu gostaria de agradecer aos esforços da professora Cecília, dos demais professores envolvidos, dos demais estudantes envolvidos na organização. Dá muito trabalho, o antes, o durante e o depois, e eu gostaria muito que houvesse um prestígio, né? Eu conversei muito com os colegas, que vocês pudessem prestigiar os próximos dias. Então, fico muito feliz. So some words for our guests. I'm very glad to welcome here. So it's a great opportunity for our students. In this case, so what can I say that? Of course I can. I'm sorry. I'm getting nervous a little bit, but I would like to welcome here, and so I hope you can have a great colloquium in next few days. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I have with me. So only a few words for our guests. Excuse me.
Muito obrigado, professor André. Vou passar a palavra, então, ao coordenador do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Filosofia da Universidade de Brasília, professor Alexandre Hahn.
Bem, de certa forma, os nossos colegas aqui já fizeram as boas-vindas, então eu queria só me somar a eles, dizendo quanto esse tipo de evento é importante, não só para aqueles que apresentam, os comunicadores, os palestrantes, principalmente para os estudantes, a fim de que nós possamos criar um ambiente de discussão filosófica que é sempre muito difícil de constituir em qualquer lugar. Isso leva um certo tempo para esse desenvolvimento dessa cultura de discussão filosófica, esse ambiente em que a filosofia não acontece apenas dentro da sala de aula. Então, esses eventos aqui são, de certa forma, o coramento de um processo de pesquisa, né, que foi feito previamente. Também uma oportunidade para os estudantes tomarem conhecimento do que é discutido dentro do pensamento do filósofo em questão, mas também para tomar conhecimento do nível de discussão filosófica elevado que nós podemos desenvolver. Então, uma espécie de modelo que poderia ser usado para ser seguido. Então, nesse sentido, o que eu posso falar em termos do programa é que para nós é uma satisfação poder aqui apoiar esse evento que foi, claro, organizado em grande medida pelos esforços da professora Cecília, claro, com outros colegas. Eu acompanhei aqui a odisseia para conseguir o financiamento, como isso sempre é muito difícil e muitas vezes ainda correndo o risco de todo o orçamento não ser viabilizado a tempo ou pelo menos apenas parte desse orçamento. Enfim, e com resiliência ela seguiu em frente, conseguiu. Então, parabéns para a nossa grande coordenadora aqui do evento. E, bem, é isso que eu posso falar e bom evento a todos. Obrigado.
Obrigado, professor Alexandre Hahn. Então, eu, como vice-diretor do Instituto de Ciências Humanas, devo falar um pouco em nome da própria universidade. A Universidade de Brasília, estando na capital federal, ela tem uma vocação internacional. Então, é uma excelente iniciativa, a gente saúda e parabeniza a organização do evento por essa possibilidade e entendo que dessa maneira está realmente cumprindo o objetivo de uma universidade que abre suas portas e está em diálogo com o restante do mundo. So, I would like to welcome everyone to this colloquium. This University of Brasilia has a vocation for international interaction. So we're very glad to see that this is happening today in this event here. And we hope that it's just the beginning of this growing interaction in history of philosophy, Pierre Bayle, in all areas of philosophy from now on. So thank you for coming, and we hope we have a very good event here. So thank you very much. E com isso, damos por encerrada a mesa de abertura. E agora vamos para a conferência, né? Então convido a professora Cecília, o professor Todd Ryan, que vai coordenar então a próxima mesa de conferência.
Obrigado e bem-vindos a essa última palestra do primeiro dia do colóquio. É um grande prazer para mim apresentar nosso último palestrante, que é o professor Jean-Luc Solère. O Jean-Luc Solère é professor de Filosofia ao Boston College. Ele é membro do Centro Nacional da Recherche Científica. Antes de chegar ao Boston College, ele ensinou à Universidade de Lille, a Bruxelas e também na Louvre. Ele é o autor de grande variedade de publicações sobre Bayle, mas também sobre a filosofia medieval. De fato, eu acho que ele tem um manuscrito, um livro que logo vai aparecer, que chama-se Forme de la Pensée Médiévale. E hoje ele vai falar sobre o semi-fideismo de Bayle. So, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jean-Luc Solère of Boston College. Professor Solère is a member of the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, and prior to arriving at Boston College, he taught at the universities of Lille, Brussels, and Louvain. He's the author of numerous publications, both on Pierre Bayle and in medieval philosophy. And he has a forthcoming book, Forme de la pensée médiévale. And tonight he's going to be speaking to us on Bayle's semi-fideism.
Thank you, Todd, for your introduction, and thank you to the organizers for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be here with you. So I'm going to talk about Bayle's semi-fideism. I chose this topic because I want to push back against the dominant interpretation of Bayle, according to many interpreters, modern and contemporary, in order to avoid being accused of blasphemy, atheism, etc. Bayle's response to the difficulties he himself rose regarding how an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-benevolent God may have let evil happen in the universe he has created. Bayle's response then would be to take refuge in some blind irrationalism, at least apparently. That is to assert that one must simply believe what Revelation teaches, namely that God is good and just, against what reason demonstrates. In my opinion, in reality, Bayle's position is far more complex. He sets out his method very clearly in this passage from his last work, where he comments on the arguments he had lined up in his famous dictionary. You should have paper handouts and also projected on the wall here. So if you could go. Oh, okay, it's here. No, not just first next. Yeah. Then it's So I was saying he presents his method very clearly in this text. I don't know if you can see. Let's see it. So I'll skip section A of this text. We'll get back to it later. In section B, Bayle explains that when reason submits to faith, in his view it can do so not by committing suicide, so to speak, jumping into the abyss of irrationality, but rather following its own rules and on its own accord. It thus continues to act as reason, that is rationality. And what makes this possible, Bayle says, are maxims that are indisputable. Indeed, one maxim that Bayle invokes repeatedly to resolve the problem of evil is that what God does is done when, that is done rightly, in every sense of the term, including the moral sense. That is, everything that God does is right. Based on this principle, we can ultimately conclude, Bayle argues, that God is not the author of evil, even though there is ample reason to think that he is. So what is a maxim for Bayle? For him, the term is synonymous with a common notion or axiom, words taken in their technical sense of fundamental principles of reason, just like the principles of identity or non-contradiction are. A maxim is therefore a fundamental proposition, self-evident to natural light. I believe Bayle is not a Pyrrhonian, them because he does unreservedly adheres to some such propositions which are incontestable, as Bayle says in passage E. It is this strong sense that should be given to the philosophical and theological maxim, as he calls it, that God can do nothing that is not right. Why does Bayle use the term maxim here rather than simply action or common notion? The reason is that this term introduces a nuance in relation to its synonyms. The term maxim belongs to the tradition of ancient dialectics as formulated by Cicero and Boëtius in their topics. It is a propositio maxima or principalis, that is a supreme proposition, universal in scope and known by itself, which is taken within an argumentative locus or place or topos. A topos is like a warehouse where arguments are stored, and then you can fetch them, that kind of action in a certain topos, and you use the maxim to draw a conclusion. Bayle wrote Todd philosophy, he wrote a course of philosophy, and in this course he defines such propositions, maxims I mean, as any axiom which contains the reason for the validity of the consequence, that is, which makes a deduction correct. In other words, it's an axiomatic proposition used as a means of inference. The example of reasoning Bayle gives in his lecture, he says, this person is an excellent poet, therefore the verses written by this person are excellent. The topos here is the notion of efficient cause. The maxim is the proposition, such is the cause, such is the effect. This is exactly the function fulfilled by the maxim, everything God does is right. It is drawn from the topos of divine perfection. Because God is perfect, he acts always perfectly. The resulting maxim endowed with an axiomatic value serves as a rule for deducing the consequence that God is not the author of evil. The intermediate link is God has done this, that is making sin possible, hence the conclusion. Therefore, it was done rightly, that is, God has done nothing wrong in the occurrence, despite the occurrences, and despite all the arguments one can find to charge God with responsibility with regard to the existence of evil. Let's take a closer look at the topos of divine perfection, from which the maxim is derived. It's based on what Bayle calls the idea of God as the sovereignly perfect or infinitely perfect being. Bayle often uses these syntax, and this idea plays an important role in this reflection. Absolute and infinite perfection is probably the major trait by which he characterizes God. Our maxim develops in a propositional form an aspect of the idea, expressing immediately something that is analytically included in the idea. The maxim is axiomatic with regard to other propositions and deductions. And so such is the case for the maxim we are talking about, which develops the notion of the all-perfect being with respect to his actions, which are all-perfect too. Bayle sometimes uses a slightly more developed expression for talking about the idea we have on God, and this provides interesting clues as to the origin and context of this expression. It talks about the vast and immense idea of the sovereignly perfect being. This formula is characteristic because of the qualifier vast and immense. It comes from Malebranche, who often uses it. We have an example in text 2. The expression in Malebranche connotes the effort of attention that reason makes to discern the perfection of God's nature. and to think of God in the truest sense, overcoming imagination and prejudice. Moreover, the expression points to God's transcendence and the necessity of not judging God according to our limited opinions and ideas, but according to his own infinite perfection. This obviously has implications for Bayle's problem concerning evil. Another example in language, in text 3, where he insists on the transcendence of God's action in function of his infinite perfection. As a consequence, the first point to note regarding Bayle's reference to the idea of God is that this idea is for Bayle an idea of reason given by natural light, as he often points out, in accordance with its Mambrachist origins. Bayle's equivalently speaks of the common notions we have of the infinitely perfect being, or, text 4, the evident notions that reason gives us of God, that is, of the infinitely perfect being, infinitely good, infinitely the enemy of vice, infinitely the friend of virtue. Second point to note, this idea, according to Bayle, is among the clearest and most distinct we have, as you can see in text 5. This fact, the fact that this notion of the sovereignly perfect being is an idea of reason and is clear and distinct, is of course crucial, for it makes it possible for Bayle to argue that the solution he proposes is rational, that is, in his own words, that he is not renouncing reason in favor of irrational fideism. It is along this line that Bayle, in the article of the dictionary on Ruffin, the poet Ruffin, that's where he rejects attempts to account for the existence of evils by presenting them, for instance, as part of the plan of divine providence for a greater good. For Bayle, it is unwise to engage in a point-by-point justification, evil by evil, so to speak, of the good order and harmony of the universe. The only result of such an attempt is endless discussions in which one should reply in a conclusive manner, that is, without being content with mere plausibility. One should respond in a conclusive manner to each of one's adversary's objections, even though these objections are multiple, ever recurring, and cannot in fact be satisfactorily answered. Instead, Bayle recommends sticking to principles, that is, responding to the opponents with common notions or actions that they cannot challenge. Thus, that's Bayle. Bayle writes in text 6, the only answer you have to give to your difficulty, that is explaining the presence of evil in the world, was to A, consider the vast and immense idea of the sovereignly perfect being, and to B, draw this consequence. He is the author of all things, he governs them all, so nothing is done that is not governed and conducted in a way that is infinitely just, infinitely admirable. In short, one should simply apply the maxim, whatever God does is done well. But in this quote, we can see clearly what it is based on. On the one hand, the absolute divine perfection. On the other, the fact that we have an appropriate idea of this perfection, an idea quite different from our ordinary ideas, an idea itself vast and immense, as Malebranche puts it. We are here not in the domain of faith, but of knowledge in its highest sense, for this idea is among the clearest and most distinct, as we have noted above, and the maxim, whatever God does is well done, which is established on this idea, is also not only irrational, but belongs to the order of actions, fundamental propositions. Hence, the quote in text 7. This fact is often overlooked by commentators who reduce Bayle's complex thought to the injunction to silence reason. The starting point for Bayle's response to the problem of evil is a rational content, the idea of the sovereignly perfect being in section A of quote 6, which is developed into a rational principle, the maxim that God acts perfectly, which is left implicit in text 6, but nonetheless is serving as the linchpin of the argument. And it is again reason that draws a conclusion about this world, like in section B of quote 6, nothing is done that is not governed and conducted in an infinitely just, infinitely admirable way. The crucial point is that Bayle uses a proposition that is an action, a rational action, and therefore carries as much rational weight in the discussion as the notions of moral goodness, after which God's conduct may be judged to be evil, as Bayle had insisted in the discussions about the Manichaeans in the dictionary. Hence, Bayle's position here is not fideistic. He does not use faith to crush reason, but uses a principle of reason against other principles of reason. Now, it is true that Bayle himself, prone to striking formulas, can suggest the opposite when read too quickly. Thus, in the same article of the dictionary, after the passage we have just commented on, he exclaims, that's where there is this famous quote, silence reason, for force it to apprise to authority, and he refers to psalms in the Bibles and eloquently embroiders on his theme, saying, like in quote 8, let us stand there immobile and unshakable, putting our finger on our mouth, imposing silence to our little lives, persuaded that in these things the best use of reason is not to reason. So Bayle does say such things. However, when he returns to the same recommendation he gave at the beginning of this whole passage, that is sticking to principles, just propose the maxim, everything that God does is done well. Then he writes, text 9, the idea of the sovereignly perfect being must be enough for them and is enough for them when they make good use of their reason. So his advice is by no means to silence reason by smothering it under the authority of religion. To silence reason is to prevent it from discussing the detail of particular reasons, that is, to try to justify the existence of particular evils or of evil as a whole by ascribing them, for example, a meaning, a function in the history of humanity, a greater good that results from them. It's a dangerous path, as Bayle says, as I noted earlier, because it's exposed to devastating objections. We must therefore restrain our reason, which is always eager to debate and quick to find explanations. We must force it to refrain from arguing on this level, but reason can still do something. It can turn to the idea of a sovereignly perfect being and assert the general maxim that what God does is not well. However, this must be its last word, must remain sheltered behind this blanket certitude. However, its silence is not a sign of defeat, as Bayle himself comments in quote 10. One does not entrench oneself in faith except under the guidance and by the orders of the most obvious maxims of reason. What then is the role of faith, according to Bayle? Because faith obviously has a role to play. At what point does it come into play? At the next stage, namely when it comes to apply the maxim, whatever God does is right, and completing the reasoning according to the process which is described very clearly in passage 11. There is not, I read, there is therefore nothing that does not conform to exactitude in the proposition where Mr. Bayle joins together natural light and revelation, even though by revelation he rejects some maxims of natural light. Reason teaches me that God is a sovereignly perfect nature, and that whatever such a nature does is well done. Nothing could be more obvious than this action. The same reason then teaches me that a good and holy being does not allow, when he can prevent it, that what he loves, that is supposedly human beings, falls into misery and crime. I consult Revelation and see there that God allowed Adam and Eve, whom he loved and had filled with good things, to lose their innocence and thereby expose all their posterity to innumerable misfortunes and a moral corruption that is horrifying. I therefore abandon the second principle that reason or natural light have taught me. I reject it as deceptive and false, since it combats the truth of fact, and I affirm, in virtue of my first action and the testimonies of Scripture, that God is good and holy. So how do we know that God has willed or carried out a certain fact or action? Not through reasoning, but only from historical reports, so to speak, which for Bayle is what the Bible is. It's a report of God's action. And the truthfulness of this report, the Bible, is accepted by faith, not established by reason. Thus, we learn from Revelation that, that's what you find in section C, evil finds its origin in Adam and Eve's decision, and that God did not stop them from going astray. These are factual truths, which we cannot know by any other means than by faith. But it is on these facts that the dictum of the maxim laid out in section A, everything that God does is done right, is applied. Therefore, we may conclude in section D, God's action, or rather inaction, since he didn't stop Adam and Eve from sin, followed by the fall of the first humans, we can conclude that this action or inaction was blameless, since God always acts perfectly, even if we do not see how that is the case. Further on, in the same work, Bayle again explains, quote 12, in order to teach his readers how they should guard against the importunate objections of the Manichaeans, he himself always brought them back to this indisputable maxim that everything God makes it well made, and that thus, as soon as we know from Scripture that God has made such a thing, we must be very assured that it contains no defect. And you find the same kind of ideas in quotes 12 prime and 12 second, our variations on the same theme. So in all these texts, we can clearly see the juxtaposition of these two elements, which Bayle could have called respectively truth of reason and truth of fact, just like Leibniz. The purely rational principle known a priori, the maxim, and the facts to which the maxim is applied, known because they are reported in the Bible and believed to be true by faith. We must therefore believe that letting Adam and Eve sin was a just and good action, because in the first place we believe that God did that. And the epistemic modality of one of the premises, belief in what the Bible reports, is transmitted to the conclusion, even if the other pillar of the argument is a rational principle, the assumption that everything God does is rightly done, the fact that the other premise is a belief is transmitted to the conclusion. So this is the extent of the subjugation of reason by faith. If we did not believe that God did this or that, we would never think that this action would be just and would occur to our reason, would be quite the contrary. But the argument that justifies the conclusion is rational. Far from stifling reason, revelation merely provides the material on which to apply a purely rational principle. Granted, in doing so, we have to put aside certain other common notions, that of morality, like the one Bayle mentions in section B of text 11, where he says the same reason that teaches me that one is guilty not to prevent a crime that one would prevent from robbery. So that's also a common notion of reason. It has to be put aside in the name of a higher principle, which is the maxim that everything God does is done well. However, these common notions of morality are neutralized by another common notion of reason, the maxim at hand. So it's a matter of rational actions yielding to another more powerful rational action. And this is customary in Bayle. It's quite as usual. What he says in section D of text 11, I therefore abandon the second principle that reason had taught me in favor of this maxim or rational action. So the two stages of this process, that is factual truth accepted by faith and rational truth dictated by reason, are distinct. One doesn't encroach on the other. So this is why I call Bayle's position a semi-fideism. There is undoubtedly recourse to faith, but it's only one half of the story. Bayle's solution rests on two mainstays, faith and reason, which complement each other. If we have the time, I'll go back to what I mean by complementing each other. I don't want to give, on the other hand, the idea that Bayle is a rationalist. He is also a semi-rationalist, say so, and he has a very particular conception of reason as fraught with certain internal contradictions, which I compare to Kant's antinomies. But setting that aside for now, I want to focus on which is the second part of my paper, that is whether Bayle offered a proof of God's existence. Because naturally the viability of the solution I've just described hangs on the existence of an ens perfectissimum on which one can count to act in a perfect way. But one may wonder whether Bayle does think that some being really corresponds to the idea of God as the sovereignly perfect being. He might, of course, uphold that conviction by faith, but there is no way to prove it, and the genuineness of his religious beliefs is often called into question by interpreters. However, Bayle happens to offer a philosophical proof of the existence of God based on the same idea of God as the supremely perfect being. So I will now examine this apparent proof and assess whether it fits into Bayle's worldview and whether it's credible or not. This proof is couched in the Continuation des Pensées diverses, chapter 111. At the end of the discussion with the Stratonicians, who are atheist and materialist disciples of the ancient philosopher Strato of Lamsaca, Bayle shows that Strato is able to oppose or retort to the a priori demonstration of the necessary existence of a non-perfect being. But Bayle claims that for his part he is not worried by Strato's retort because, as he puts it, he knows a posteriori that God possesses perfection of all sorts. So here we can move forward. We have symmetry here. It's a reproduction of the whole page of the contribution of the chapter. It should be further down. No, it should be way down. For those who have which number is it? No, it's not numbered, it's a reproduction of the 31st. We have seen it briefly. When Cecilia. There we go. Right. No, it starts here, je ne m'en passe pas, il suffit de savoir a posteriori. So Bayle says he's not worried by Strato's retort against the a priori demonstration because, he says, he knows a posteriori that God possesses perfection of all sorts, which means that, therefore, God is different from nature or matter, that is different from the first principle of the Straton issues. And it's here that Bayle offers, apparently, a demonstration of God's existence. By contrast with the a priori proof, Bayle seems rather happy and assertive with this a posteriori demonstration, which he presents in the following way. So, I ask you to go back to text 14 in the handout that I have mine. I just wanted to sorry to put you to contribution. Yeah, 14. Yeah. Because I wanted to read the translation in English. So it's enough for me to know a posteriori, at least that God possesses all sorts of perfections. I know this, as Mr. Descartes does, by the idea of a sovereignly perfect being, which I feel in myself. I'm convinced that as only God can move bodies, only God can communicate ideas to us. So it's not the cause of them, it does not know in what way they are arose. It would like to have some that it does not have, it has some that it would like not to have. If it drew them for its own end, it would not represent anything more perfect than itself. It is therefore God who communicates to us the idea we have of Him. He therefore exists in sovereign perfection, for if He were not such, He could not put into our minds this idea. Put it into our minds. Frankly, I trust this more than the a priori reason that any limitation must be caused by an external agent, which was the thrust of the a priori demonstration retorted by Straton. So as you can see, Bayle is pretty happy with this demonstration, at least so he says. And obviously, Bayle borrows this demonstration from Descartes' first or a posteriori proof in the third meditation. The starting point is the same, the acknowledgement of the presence in his mind of the idea of an absolutely perfect being. The procedure is always the same. We have to assign a cause to the presence of this idea. And the thrust of the argument in section C is identical to, we cannot be the cause of that idea since our imperfect nature, or any other imperfect nature for that matter, would not be able to generate content, what Descartes called the objective reality of this idea, that represents an absolutely perfect being. Hence the conclusion in D, only the perfect being represented by this idea was able to cause this idea. This idea exists, therefore it's cause God exists, and God is a supremely perfect being. However, Bayle gives Descartes' proof a Malebranchian twist, drawing in section B on the oratorian demonstration in the Conversation chrétienne, which rests on his occasionalism in the occurrence, the impossibility for the soul, which parallels the inability of bodies to cause motion, the inability for the soul to produce its own modifications, not even a mere sensation, because of the principle that when you do not know how a thing is done, then you cannot be the one who makes that thing. In fact, already in his course of philosophy, Bayle had associated two proofs, I mean Descartes and Malebranche, presenting them in a more detailed way and with more technical vocabulary. And then finally combining them into a new proof. He explicitly presents it in a new proof, saying in the course then, we should turn in a similar way the argument we draw from the idea of a very perfect being, that is Descartes' argument, which we find in ourselves. Our soul cannot be the cause, since it's not the cause of other thoughts. And so combines Descartes' proof with Malebranche's proof in the course of philosophy. It is just this demonstration of the course that Bayle reiterates, but in a condensed form, in the continuation of the diverse thoughts. As he makes it clear, he believes that this proof is an innovation of his. It is right, because whereas Malebranche's proof does not rely at all on the idea of God, but only on the necessity of a cause that is not only external to ourselves, but also all knowing in order to explain the occurrence of our thoughts, our mind. So whereas Malebranche keeps the idea of God, Bayle enlists Malebranche's theory in the service of the proof by the idea of God that is present in Descartes, and thus presents a third proof, which is neither in Descartes nor in Malebranche. One might think that this occasionalist thesis makes Descartes' argument redundant, because if anyway we do not generate any of our ideas, what is the point in singling out the idea of ens perfectissimi, to argue that it must come from a cause external to ourselves? This is precisely why Malebranche does not rely on this idea in the Conversation chrétienne. But we should keep in mind that what Bayle is interested in is to demonstrate not just the existence of God, but his existence as a supremely perfect being, which is to say that our idea of the infinitely perfect being, on which he relies for his response to the problem of evil, as we saw, that this idea does correspond to such a being in reality. Even if we are not able to produce ideas, it should be confirmed that no other external cause than God is able to cause this idea in us, or that this idea does not derive from other ideas, even if all given by God, but that this idea has a direct link to a being whose characteristics match its content. This is why Bayle has to use Descartes' argument that the idea of an infinitely perfect being can only come from an existing infinitely perfect being. Malebranche, for his part, does not need to use that argument, because for him, thinking of the infinite is thinking directly of God's essence itself, that is to say, not through an idea in our mind that would be representative of the infinite. But Bayle does not admit this thesis of Malebranche. He rejects the so-called theory of the vision in God. So for Bayle, thinking of this idea is not having our gaze directly set on God. Bayle has to prove that the nature of God, as depicted by this idea, is the source of this idea. So, for Bayle, then, contrary to Malebranche, the starting point of the proof is an idea that is in our mind, and we have to wonder how it came about and make certain that its cause has a one-on-one correspondence with the idea. Hence, this new demonstration presented by Bayle, which, it bears repeating, is neither in Descartes nor in Malebranche. So, naturally, Jean-Luc Solère, who is the main representative of this line of interpretation of Bayle as dissimulating himself under the apparatus of blind faith, blind irrationalist fideism. So naturally, Solère wants to discredit Bayle's demonstration and claim that in the Continuation des Conseils verse 111, we must read between the lines a refutation of the Malebranche's proof of God's existence, because 2 paragraphs further down, Bayle adds that the occasionalist thesis implies that God is also the cause of our volitions, that is to say, of evil, when our volitions are evil. If God creates all the modifications of our mind, then God creates our evil volitions, and so God is responsible for our evil. And after these remarks, Bayle simply says, I do not enter into this mystery, one must humbly resort to revealed light. And you have the full text in the copy of the universe. So Solère sees in this conclusion one of Bayle's pirouettes by which to protect himself. He's taking refuge behind the smoke screen of God's and mathematical plan. However, I wish to challenge Solére's quick dismissal of his proof of the existence of God. I'll make 2 points. First point, the occasionalist thesis is not the only one that leads to the consequence that Bayle underlines, that is God's responsibility for evil. This consequence is Bayle's constant conclusion regarding the problem of evil. In fact, the difficulty posed by the existence of evil is inescapable, whether one is an occasionalist or not. No theory, except Manichaeism, avoids this difficulty. On the side of non-occasionalist theories, for multiple reasons, in which I do not need to enter here, ascribing agency to human beings, so contrary to occasionalism, that is acknowledging that human beings have free will and also cause their own volition. This does not solve the problem, as Bayle explains at length. Bayle challenges the thesis that God gave humans a mere permission to sin, whether these observants are occasionalists or not. Thus, there is no unique and privileged connection between the demonstration of God's existence in CPD 111 and the consequence that God is the cause of evil. The fact that Bayle emphasizes this consequence does not prove, in my opinion, that he disavows the proof he has just given. This is just Baylean business as usual. For Bayle, any theory whatsoever is plagued by problems, as he says in text 1, section 8, the one we haven't read, you can refer to text 1. This is true not only of philosophical and theological theories, but even of scientific ones, as he explains very clearly in the case of the question of the divisibility of extension. Aristotle's divisibility, infinite divisibility, is unsatisfactory, but so are the other 2, both of which are indivisibilist, the mathematical points thesis and the atomist thesis. In many ways, each of these solutions clashes with indisputably evident principle. Same thing for the question of the existence of void in nature. More generally, Bayle is keen on showing that no system can definitely prevail over the others. Each, in turn, triumphs over the others when making objections, but then succumbs to counter-objections. And dispute will never end, will be never settled. So the fact that the thesis entails thorny difficulties does not mean that Bayle rejects it. This thesis may have sufficient evidence on its side for being endorsed, even though those difficulties cannot be solved. This is also what Bayle's reflection on extension, divisibility, and on emptiness reveal. See what he says in text 15. The difficulties he sees in the Aristotelian position do not prevent him from endorsing his Aristotelian position. So Bayle's final remark in CPD 111, that is that the proof that of the existence of God based on occasionalism leads to the recognition that God is responsible for evil. His final remark is simply consistent with Bayle's meta-philosophy, according to which every philosophical thesis encounters its own difficulties, intractable difficulties, at least intractable in a direction. Bayle can very well admit the validity of the proof he has just given, and at the same time recognize that it runs up against a difficult issue. This is the fate of each and every theory at one point or another. Conversely, the fact that he underlies the difficulty does not necessarily imply that he rejects it. My second point regarding Maurice's dismissal of this proof offered by Bayle is that, yes, after making this remark, Bayle does appeal to the lines of revelation, but this is only part of his semi-fideistic solution, as we saw earlier. He has something else to say on the matter other than a mere irrationalist fideist statement. He does not have to develop it here in CPD 111, but we know that he has a solution, that he has a response. Consequently, one cannot infer from the fact that in this passage he only mentions revelation, that this is a smoke screen which suggests that Bayle is hinting that he is not to be taken seriously when he presents his proof of the existence of God. However, there is a real difficulty for my reading of CPD 111. It is that, as Maurice has argued, Bayle, in a text of his youth, dated 1679, had criticized in a certain Pierre Bayle a similar proof of God's existence, so similarly inspired by Descartes, and thus close to Bayle's own version in CPD. In these objections to Bayle, Bayle blocked the argument by asserting the possibility for a finite mind to generate by itself, by its own capacity of reason, the idea of the infinite on the basis of finite experiences. So this idea does not have to be given by an external cause, namely God himself. So that is true, that's unquestionable. Bayle said that in 1679. Nonetheless, in the light of Bayle's own use of that idea of God in CPD 111, we are faced with a trilemma. First alternative, Bayle may simply have formulated this objection against Bayle's proof in accordance with the role he sets for himself in the preface to the objections, which is to act as the devil's advocate and raise all kinds of issues, as you can see in quote 16. Since Poiré in the corresponding passage makes uncritical use of the idea of absolute perfection without discussing its possible origins, Bayle is playing his part when he signals that the reasoning can be challenged. Poiré's argument has a gap here that he would do well to fill. So this is not to say that Bayle necessarily views these objections as unanswerable, but it's not his role in this text, in the objections to Poiré, to bring answers to his own objections. Or, second alternative, we should conclude that Bayle changed his mind after 1679. For example, after reading or rereading Malebranche, since Malebranche gives an answer to the same objection, the same type of objection that Bayle made to Poiret, and which is in fact inspired by the objection that Gassendi had made to Descartes. So perhaps Bayle changed his mind on this count. There is no reason to consider the objection to Poiret as the final stage of Bayle's thinking, after which he would have only covered his tracks by presenting to adhere to a thesis in which he does not believe. If we reject these first two alternatives, then we are left with the third one. We have to admit that Bayle blatantly lies, when he says in CPD 111 that he is satisfied by this a posteriori demonstration he offers. But I ask, why would he lie there? Nothing was obliging him to introduce this so-called a posteriori proof at this juncture. He was criticizing the a priori proof. He could have left it at that. What compelled him to add, hey, I have a better proof, which runs as follows, here it is. Is it to cover up the fact that he does not believe that there is any valid demonstration of God's existence? That would be an odd strategy because of the nature of this substitute demonstration that Bayle seems to offer. In the first place, this strategy would be risky because his objections to Poiret had been published in 1685. It was therefore easy to spot, just as Maury does, the contradiction between his two writings. Bayle would have tied himself into an embarrassing position. In the second place, the alleged strategy of dissimulation would be strange because at the end of the passage where he refutes Poiret's proof, Bayle adds that the Cartesians might be tempted to adopt the occasionalist thesis of the complete passivity of the soul as a possible solution to the objection he just raised. But Bayle adds this will not work because on the one hand, occasionalism entails that God is the author of sins, and on the other hand, the occasionalist epistemological thesis will be mocked by most people because it appears to negate the soul's faculty of reason. So it won't convince them that it assures a compelling demonstration of God's existence. Well, as for the first point, God's responsibility regarding evil, we have clarified earlier that this consequence is not tied to occasionalism only, and Bayle anyway has a response to that problem. As for the second point, this remark makes the alleged strategy of dissimulation in CPD 111 very implausible in my view. The occasionalist epistemology thesis, which he says in the objection to Poiret is a hard sell and will only attract derision, is precisely the one he adopts as a mainstay of his own version of the a posteriori proof. So how would he expect then to make readers believe that he has a convincing demonstration of the existence of God, to which he genuinely adheres? Malebranche himself had acknowledged that anyway, this kind of demonstration of the existence of God are not obvious for everyone. We have an example in the text 17. So if Bayle's intention in CPD 111 was to hide his true thinking and to hide the fact that he does not believe that there is any demonstration of the existence of God, and if his goal was to give the appearance that he was persuaded by at least one proof of God's existence, why would he choose this most improbable proof instead of invoking, I don't know, a more classical, cosmological, or teleological proof, more readily accepted by the common man, as Malebranche says? Why hide behind the least convincing disguise? If it's meant to be a red herring, why choose one that would be so easily detected? because of its implausibility in the eyes of most readers. Of the three alternatives I've just presented, the first two seem to be much more likely than the third one. There is no illogism in taking Bayle's statement in CPD 111 at its face value. Thus, nothing precludes that Bayle is convinced by the combined Cartesian Malebranche's demonstration that there is a sovereign imperfect being, even if that has the unfortunate consequence that God contributes to evil. But again, this is in line with Bayle's oft-stated conviction that no thesis is free from difficulties. And anyway, Bayle is prepared to deal with this consequence by other means, that is, with his original combination of rationalism and semi-fideism. Thank you.
Muito obrigado para essa fala muito rica, essa interpretação do Bayle como não ateu, não peronista, mas um tipo de fideísta. Eu acho que vai solicitar muitas perguntas, com certeza. So, thanks to Professor Solère for this very rich discussion and this interpretation of Bayle as neither Pyrrhonian skeptic nor atheist, but as a semi-fideist who offers a proof of God's existence.